Covert nuclear development has some very interesting technologies and perspectives associated with it, especially in light of current events. Those perspectives, through the lens of a historical event with widespread consequences, is what we're here to discuss today. In this video, I will also present a piece of evidence that has remained untouched in public discussions, but sheds light on what caused this incident. Nuclear programs are yet again a hot topic. This shouldn't surprise anyone. Nuclear is the cornerstone of modern technology and security. Yet, like many topics we treat on this channel, nuclear tech is both misunderstood and underrepresented in the public discourse. In the absence of obstacles, every nation with ambitions of sovereignty and technological progress will inevitably pursue a robust nuclear industrial base. And this kind of activity will always be capable of producing nuclear weapons. Given the state of the modern world, the only way to prevent a state with self-sufficient nuclear industry from developing nuclear arms is via enforcement, and failing that, intervention. There are many examples of this process in history, and as we go back in time, the enforcement of nonproliferation changes. Not so long ago, it was more or less accepted that some nations would pursue nuclear programs, even contrary to international regulations and norms. Today, regulatory agencies like the International Atomic Energy Agency use real-time monitoring of nuclear infrastructure to ensure no nations pursue nuclear weapons. At mines all over the world, samples of ore are regularly taken and their isotope ratios measured to determine whether nuclear material is being covertly extracted. 30 or 50 years ago, the methods used in enforcement were less sophisticated, and often the only option available to curtail nuclear programs were sanctions or trade restrictions. The Vela Incident reflects this historical reality fully, and teaches us important lessons on nonproliferation, while illustrating how the political repercussions of nuclear development have changed from warnings to direct actions. We'll start by going back to the inception of nonproliferation, at which time South Africa was already a topic of discussion. The South African nuclear program began in 1944, when Winston Churchill asked then Prime Minister Jan C. Smuts to take inventory of South Africa's uranium stock. Smuts, who supported nuclear nonproliferation after the war, once told Churchill that it, the nuclear bomb, will no longer remain a secret, and its disclosure after the war may start the most destructive competition in the world. Smuts concluded, "If ever there was a matter for international control, this is the one." 5 years later, the Soviet Union would detonate its first fission device, and this was detected by US fallout monitoring stations. The UK would join the League of Nuclear Nations in 1952, detonating a plutonium fission device in the Montebello Islands in Australia. The first Soviet hydrogen bomb would be tested just 3 years later, in 1955. At this time, South Africa had 16 mines authorized to produce uranium. Just 2 years later, South Africa would receive its first major boost to its nuclear program, a 50-year collaboration agreement with the United States that would peak with the US delivering a Safari-1 20-megawatt light water reactor in the mid-1960s. This reactor consumed highly enriched uranium fuel, making it viable for weapons-grade material production, though far from efficient. 2 years after acquiring the reactor in 1965, South Africa began exporting up to 90% enriched uranium to its close partners, though in secrecy. It wouldn't be until 1970, 3 years after enrichment began, that the program would be made public. The 1970s would see major escalations of the program towards weapons development, as South Africa found its own atomic energy corporation and constructed the Building 5000 enrichment complex. In 1971, the program would draw from two sources to put into effect its ambitions and begin a secret nuclear weapons program in earnest. Both resources used to accomplish this coming from the United States. First, it would coordinate with the US Plowshare program, which developed peaceful nuclear devices, PNEs, for mining and excavation applications. Second, it would draw from declassified Los Alamos data to prototype implosion-type devices. South Africa is described as having a good technological base with respect to electronics and metallurgy because of its uranium enrichment program, but it has no expertise in internal ballistics, an essential part of any implosion device. Two different research groups would work on implosion devices in South Africa. Workers of the Atomic Energy Board, who were tasked on the RO division towards peaceful nuclear devices, and the Kentron Circle, previously employed at domestic research reactors. The Kentron Circle would aim their ambitions towards nuclear weapons from the onset, and over time the most trusted RO personnel would migrate to the higher Kentron Circle. 3 years later, in 1974, the US would commission nuclear reactors in France to enrich fuel rods for export to South Africa. At the same time, the state began operation of its first native enrichment reactor, dubbed the Y plant. The government commissioned 7 nuclear weapons at this juncture, citing the perceived expansionist threat of the Soviet Union. Remember this for later. The US would learn of this development 2 years after, triggering a cascade of policy reversals and sanctions against South Africa. These would be short-lived. Within 1 year of the Y plant coming online, South Africa commits to its weapons program by preparing for testing. They excavate underground nuclear test sites in the Kalahari Desert and prepare an above-ground test site. They also complete another nuclear plant to produce uranium hexafluoride, further reducing reliance on foreign imports. In 1976, we see a shift in South African commitments from international cooperation and regulation towards covert activity. John Vorster, the Prime Minister of South Africa, who was once dubbed a Nazi sympathizer, visits Israel and arranges an agreement wherein Israel provides nuclear technicians and expertise. This agreement is unofficial, but it is reported by John Adams, then a prominent journalist on covert warfare. South Africa does sign an official agreement later that year, with France, to establish regular fuel and material imports to supply their reactors. 1 year later, they cut ties to the IAEA safeguards, officially becoming a rogue nuclear program with reduced international oversight. With the US suspending fuel exports to the African country, they turn again to their ally Israel in 1977 and arrange an exchange for 30 grams of tritium in exchange for 50 tons of yellow cake, a concentrated form of uranium. The tritium is shipped secretly in packages of just 2.5 grams to avoid detection by international authorities. This is the first time the weapons program faces major setbacks, likely due to the increasing restrictions being placed on it. The imported tritium is not used, and researchers opt for moving forward with a more rudimentary gun-type weapon instead of the more advanced implosion design. However, this moment is also an important milestone, as the program assembles the first gun-type device, securing major technical progress. Within 12 months, the Y plant is producing highly enriched uranium, securing a domestic source for weapons-grade material. Shortly after, South Africa faces its first major nuclear incident when hydrogen gas buildup in one of their reactors interacts with uranium hexafluoride and causes a reactor shutdown. On the 22nd of September 1979, at 0053 UTC, US Vela satellite OPS-6911 detected a double flash signature in the South Atlantic off the coast of South Africa. These satellites were designed to detect unsanctioned nuclear weapons tests by measuring gamma, X-ray, and neutron emissions, as well as having a high-frequency light detector capable of detecting the telltale double flash that only nuclear detonations produce. This incident is initially reported as a 2 to 3 kiloton nuclear detonation, but authorities quickly withdraw their statement and insist no detonation ever occurred, chalking up the false positive to a micrometeorite impact on the detection array. To this day, the official position on the Vela incident is that the cause of the event cannot be determined. Over the next 2 years, technical cooperation with France, Germany, and the US continues, with the sale of advanced computers and inspection equipment. South Africa largely achieves nuclear self-sufficiency during this time, able to meet most of its own domestic demand using local sources. At the end of 1982, the Nuclear Energy Act is ratified, which makes it illegal to discuss uranium reserves or output within the country. With multiple gun-type devices successfully assembled, the Building 5000 complex is closed permanently. South Africa also achieves a major political victory by securing uranium imports from Germany, which undermines US influence. In response, export companies that brokered uranium sales between the US and South Africa are for the first time requested by US authorities to apply for export licenses. At the same time, South Africa exports its first batch of domestically produced material to Belgium and Switzerland, another major turning point for the program. The political division of apartheid reaches its zenith in late 1982, with the African National Congress retaliating against the South African Defense Forces' raids on Maseru, Lesotho, in which 72 civilians and ANC members are killed. In retaliation, the ANC bombs the Coburg 1 nuclear reactor, causing 4 different explosions and extensive damage. Over the next 2 years, 25 US nuclear experts are illegally hired by the AEC in South Africa, and negotiations with the IAEA are reopened. However, some plants remain unmonitored. By the end of 1984, South Africa is supplying 70% of the uranium imports of Taiwan. Various deals are brokered for the purchasing of heavy water production plants from Switzerland, and radioactive waste dumping is also arranged. The South African government officially denies some of these deals. Dumping sites are secured in the country, and importation of nuclear waste from all over the world begins. 1985 is another pivotal year for the nuclear program. The US and UK terminate their cooperation agreements, bringing an abrupt end to Western support. US anti-apartheid legislation is extended to include their nuclear program, bolstering public opposition. Israel reportedly ratifies the Israel-South Africa nuclear agreement, though both nations officially deny the action. An American senator and India's chief army staff general accuse the Chinese government of exporting nuclear tech to South Africa, an allegation that is also denied by both parties. In spite of the official sanctions, the French nuclear company Framatome continues to export nuclear fuel. In 1986, Swedish company Scandiflash sells its Rontgen absorber system to South Africa, allowing nuclear testing to occur without satellite detection. At this point, any nuclear tests conducted would not be known to us today. South African diplomats insist all reactor sites are producing low-enriched material, up to a maximum of 3.25% enrichment. However, at the same time, the Kalahari underground test site is opened for the first time, with a 100-meter-long hangar erected to conceal activity. However, US and Soviet satellites detect the activity regardless. IAEA agreements collapse, and monitoring of the largest enrichment plant finally comes to an end. South African attempts to heal this damage come with assurances they will adhere to non-proliferation treaty terms moving forward, but only if they are allowed to export uranium fuel. In 1988, Foreign Minister Pik Botha announces South Africa is capable of making nuclear weapons, the first official admission. A secret missile launch is detected by the US shortly after, who remark that the missile's capabilities closely match the Israeli Jericho nuclear-capable missile. Elected in 1989, the new president of South Africa convenes AEC officials and requests a timeline for ending the nuclear program, signaling the imminent end of the state's nuclear ambitions. An inventory of 6 nuclear gun-type devices are marked for disassembly in 1991. At the same time, Derek Smith, an English citizen living in Greece, is arrested with 5.5 pounds of pure uranium, and investigation reveals a store of 550 pounds in his possession, all stored in a secret location in South Africa. Apartheid is coming to an end by 1990, with bans on the African National Congress ending and the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. Cooperation with the Nonproliferation Treaty is finally met, and major nuclear facilities across the country are dismantled. Critical weapons design technology is destroyed. The state has stored enough nuclear fuel at this point to supply domestic power plants for the foreseeable future, negating concerns of energy independence. Around the end of apartheid, the United Nations begins investigating the role of Israel in illegally assisting the development of nuclear-capable missiles and nuclear weapons in South Africa. By the end of 1991, weapons dismantling is completed, the NPT treaty is being observed, and normal uranium trade from South Africa resumes in accordance with international agreements. Legislation is drafted which prevents any future revivals of the nuclear weapons program. President F.W. de Klerk announced to the shock of the world in 1993 that South Africa had built and dismantled 6 nuclear weapons over the last decades, both cementing suspicions and also redeeming South Africa's public image to an extent. International relations continued to heal throughout the 1990s, and for the first time, officials admitted South Africa had been enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels, declaring they at one point had enough material for 30 nuclear bombs, since just 1981. Later discussions reveal the true output of the nuclear program was even greater, with over 400 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium produced as far back as the 1970s. Systematic destruction of documentation makes any appraisals of the historical production rates moving forward impossible. To this day, all knowledge of the South African nuclear program in this period comes from our historical awareness, and there will never be a way to appraise its capabilities beyond what we knew in 1992. Interestingly, a reserve of weapons-grade material was retained throughout the phasing out and still exists today. Historical perspective has revealed other contentious aspects of this affair. Israel has been accused of assisting South African military modernization on multiple fronts, including torpedoes and naval vessels, fighters, tanks, and helicopters. Other states are implicated in illegally assisting the South African nuclear program as well, including Italy, Belgium, France, Spain, Taiwan, Bulgaria, and China. Not only state officials, but private companies as well from all of these nations. While these nations touted their allegiance to UN declarations and non-proliferation treaties, they consorted behind closed doors, eventually enabling the manufacture and alleged testing of nuclear weapons in direct defiance of international agreement. It's worth noting private companies played a large role in this process. The space research company in Vermont used publicly acknowledged contacts in the CIA to export weapons technology to South Africa, including missile and artillery systems. These specific dealings were done through Israeli clients, which SRC already had ties with. This export is considered directly responsible for the development of South Africa's nuclear-capable G5 howitzer system. All of this leaves us wondering, with the vast evidence available, how and why was the Vela Incident concealed by US officials up to and including the president? After the incident, multiple US agencies led investigations with varying and inconclusive results. Some claimed it was an Israeli or South African test, and others fell back on the micrometeor or computer malfunction explanation. In 2003, the Director of Central Intelligence during the Carter administration flipped his position and states the Vela Incident was a man-made phenomenon, ruling out the official explanation of a micrometeor impact. Jimmy Carter's public statements while in office that the incident was not a nuclear test only held water thanks to the cooperation and echoing of news media. There is no real basis for the claim, considering the Vela satellite had multiple detection methods, which ruled out a malfunction as near impossibility. Had the media not parroted the official story, nobody would have believed the narrative. Carter, in his 2010 memoir, White House Diaries, states his true belief, that the Vela Incident was an undisclosed nuclear test. We have a growing belief among our scientists that the Israelis did indeed conduct a nuclear test explosion in the ocean near the southern end of South Africa. Carter's national security advisor in a 2016 interview mirrored this sentiment. There is one major piece of evidence that, for me, indicates the Vela Incident was likely a South African weapon, not an Israeli weapon, as Jimmy Carter and others believed. Recall we discussed earlier how 7 nuclear devices were originally commissioned under the Kentron Circle, but by 1993 only 6 were accounted for and disassembled. No historical source I've found has made this connection, but it seems to me an obvious smoking gun. The 7th missing device was responsible for the Vela explosion. The reality today is that any material about South Africa's nuclear program, the Vela Incident, and international involvement that didn't reach the shredder are still classified, hence our reliance on eyewitness statements. However, information we do have paints a clear picture. International organizations, companies, and governments were complicit in circumventing international law and nonproliferation agreements, with the end result of an unsanctioned and successful nuclear weapons program. Let us also not forget that during all of these events, South Africa was a regimental apartheid state, which ruled based on race-specific laws. For nations with a history of racial discrimination against their people or others, this is a disturbing reality. We're left wondering, why did the US cover up the Vela Incident? I think the answer is honestly simple. If they hadn't, there would have been an expectation for decisive action, up to military intervention, and there was no public or political support for such an act. South Africa is a vital asset for international nuclear industry even today, and shutting down its clandestine activities in the 1970s was simply not justifiable. We know from this historical case that private companies in our most regulated fields are not immune to conflicts of interest, enabling dangerous activity, or circumventing the rules of our global order. A harsh truth, but an important one. Thanks for watching, guys. I've been wanting to talk about this one for a long time. There's really no discussion of the Vela Incident in depth out there, unless you go digging, or you find some obscure footnotes in various history books. So I hope you got something out of this. I know it's a little bit dark. We'll get onto some lighter topics later. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe to keep the channel growing, and good night.